The general had fought in Poland. He had fought in France. He had commanded armor on the Eastern Front through 2 winters that had killed men he considered harder than himself. He had a Knight's Cross, a service record that ran to 4 pages, and a reputation among his own staff for a kind of icy composure that nothing seemed to disturb. At 0340 on a March morning in northern Italy, sitting at his own desk in his own headquarters, he asked his adjutant to bring him a clean uniform jacket. He wanted to surrender, looking like an officer, not a man dragged out of bed. He had not yet seen the men outside. He had only heard, through the door, a sound he could not immediately place. Later he would describe it as the quietest sound he had ever found frightening. This is not a story about a surrender. Surrenders happened constantly in the final spring of the war in Italy. Entire companies walking into captivity with their hands raised, exhausted men glad to be finished with it. What happened at this farmhouse outside the town of Fusignano in March 1945 was not that. This was a senior German commander, fully armed, fully staffed, protected by a perimeter of seasoned infantry, who chose surrender over a fight he was entirely capable of attempting. He chose it in less than 4 minutes. What forced that decision was not artillery, not air support, not numerical advantage. His own force outnumbered the men who came for him by more than 3-1. What forced it was 40 Gurkha soldiers and a name that had already traveled through the German officer corps in Italy as something between a rumor and a warning. This is the story of how that reputation was built and what it bought on one cold morning without a shot being fired. By March 1945, the war in Italy had become a slow, grinding argument over which side could afford to keep fighting longer. The Gothic line had been breached the previous autumn. The German 10th Army was conducting a fighting withdrawal northward, trading ground for time, hoping, as many senior officers privately admitted in letters home, for a political solution that would spare them a Soviet-style ending. The sector around the Sinjo River, in the flat agricultural country of the Romagna, was held by elements of a German infantry division, reinforced with armor. The terrain favored the defender. Irrigation canals, farmhouses converted into strong points, flat fields that gave clear fields of fire in every direction. Lieutenant General Erhard Voss had established his forward headquarters in a substantial farmhouse 2 miles behind the front line. It was a sound tactical choice. Close enough to direct his regiments without delay, far enough back that a frontal assault would need to fight through 2 full lines of infantry first. Voss had survived Stalingrad's periphery, the retreat through Ukraine, and 18 months of fighting in Italy. He did not frighten easily, and his staff would later attest that nothing in his manner suggested a man preparing for defeat. If you're finding value in this story, take a second to subscribe. This channel exists to tell the war's overlooked chapters, and there are many more waiting. By the spring of 1945, German intelligence summaries circulating among officers in Italy had developed a specific, almost folkloric vocabulary around Gurkha units. The language was professional on the page and uneasy underneath it. Reports described Gurkha night patrols with a discipline of silence that German reconnaissance units could not match. Captured German soldiers, when interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, used words like unhorbar, inaudible, to describe how Gurkha patrols moved through positions that should have been impossible to approach undetected. None of this was exaggeration manufactured for propaganda. The 8th Indian Division and its Gurkha battalions had spent the Italian campaign building a documented record. Positions infiltrated without a sentry raising an alarm. Prisoners taken from forward outposts without a shot fired, German patrols that simply did not return and were found, days later, in positions that made clear they had never seen what was coming. What spread fastest through the German lines was not any single battle. It was the kukri itself. Specifically, the manner in which German soldiers who survived close encounters described it. Not as a weapon, among other weapons, but as something that changed the psychological terms of a night engagement entirely. A rifle exchange was a contest. A Gurkha night raid with blades was not experienced by survivors as a contest at all. The operation that brought 40 Gurkha soldiers within sight of Voss's farmhouse began 3 days earlier, not as an assault, but as reconnaissance. Subedar Major Don Gurung, 22 years in Gurkha service, a man who had fought in North Africa before Italy and had been recommended twice for decoration, he had twice deflected onto the men under him, had been tasked with identifying gaps in the German line ahead of a planned divisional advance across the Sinjo. Gurung's patrols did not move the way conventional reconnaissance moved. He preferred small groups, 4 to 6 men, operating at night, mapping not just German positions but the spaces between them, the seams, the places where one unit's responsibility ended and the next began, the kind of administrative gap that exists in every defensive line, and that most reconnaissance never bothers to find because it is not where the enemy is. It is where the enemy is not. On the second night, one of his patrols crossed nearly a mile behind the forward German positions without encountering a single sentry, and returned with a detailed account of a substantial farmhouse showing unusual activity, staff cars, dispatch riders, radio antennae visible against the moonlight. Gurung reported it up the chain. Within hours, intelligence officers had confirmed through other sources that the farmhouse was a divisional or corps-level headquarters. The opportunity was obvious. The complication was equally obvious. A target that valuable would not be lightly defended. It was not. German records recovered after the war confirmed what Allied intelligence had already suspected. Voss's headquarters was protected by a full infantry company in immediate proximity, with additional troops in supporting positions within a half-mile. Conservative estimates placed the total defensive strength at somewhere between 140 and 160 men against the 40 Gurkhas under Gurung's command. A conventional assessment would have called the ratio prohibitive. Gurung's assessment, when he presented it to his battalion commander, was built on a different premise entirely. He was not proposing to defeat 150 men. He was proposing to make those 150 men irrelevant by going around them in the dark and arriving at the one place, the headquarters itself, where their numbers did not matter, because a general surrounded in his own office by men who are already inside cannot be reinforced by soldiers a half-mile away who do not yet know anything has happened. The plan depended entirely on speed and silence holding for the length of the approach. If either failed even once, 40 men would be caught in open ground, deep behind enemy lines, against more than 3 times their number. Gurung's request went up through 2 levels of command. It was approved with a single caveat. If the patrol was detected before reaching the objective, it was to withdraw immediately, with no attempt at the original target. The risk was judged acceptable only because the cost of failure, if managed correctly, was retreat rather than annihilation. Gurung accepted the condition without argument. He'd already decided, privately, that detection was not something he intended to allow to happen. They moved out at 23:30 on the night of March 17th, 40 men in 4 sections of 10, following the route the reconnaissance patrol had already mapped, the seams between units, the drainage canals that ran perpendicular to the German lines, and offered both concealment and a navigable path in darkness. The Romagna countryside in March is wet, cold, and largely silent at night, except for the canals themselves, which carry a constant low sound of moving water that Gurung's men had noted during reconnaissance and intended to use. Sound discipline in Gurkha units of this period was not an abstraction. It was drilled to the level of how a man's webbing was taped down, how canteens were packed so they could not shift and click, how boots were wrapped at the toe to deaden contact with stone. The patrol crossed the first German support line at 0040, moving through a gap between 2 platoon positions that Gurung's reconnaissance had confirmed was unmanned between midnight and 0200, a rotation gap, the kind of administrative detail that exists in every unit's routine and that almost nobody outside that unit ever learns, except a Gurkha patrol that had spent 2 nights watching exactly when sentries changed. By 0200, they were a mile behind the forward line, moving through farmland in the dark, navigating by terrain, features memorized during planning rather than by any light source. At 0300, the farmhouse came into view, windows lit, two sentries visible at the main entrance, a third patrolling a slow circuit of the perimeter. Gurung split his force without a word being spoken above a whisper. 10 men to cover the road approach, 10 to cover the rear field. 20, with Gurung himself, to take the building directly. The sentries at the farmhouse door were not negligent men. German accounts of the period consistently describe rear area security at this stage of the war as alert, given how thoroughly Allied reconnaissance and partisan activity had already taught every headquarters unit in northern Italy to expect trouble from unexpected directions. They were alert to the directions they had been trained to expect trouble from. The road. The open fields to the south, facing the Allied lines. Nobody had briefed them on the canal system to the north, because the canal system to the north ran through terrain that the divisional staff had assessed, accurately by every conventional measure, as too difficult to move a meaningful force through undetected. At 0327, the patrolling sentry completing his circuit at the rear of the building was approached from two directions simultaneously by men he did not see until they were within arm's reach. The encounter that followed lasted, by Gurung's own later account, perhaps 4 seconds. It was conducted without firearms and without sound that carried beyond the immediate vicinity of the building. The two sentries at the main entrance were dealt with in the same manner, in the same span of time, by a separate pair of Gurung's men, who had been given the timing to move on the rear sentry's silence as their signal. Inside the farmhouse, the headquarters staff, clerks, signalers, two junior officers working through dispatches by lamplight, became aware that something had changed only when Gurkha soldiers were already standing in the doorway of the room. General Voss was in a smaller room at the rear of the farmhouse that had been converted into his personal office, working through a situation map with his chief of staff, when the door opened without a knock. What happened in the next 90 seconds exists in slightly different versions depending on the source. Voss's own post-war account, the recollections of two of his surviving staff officers, and Gurung's report filed through Allied channels within 48 hours. The versions agree on the essential shape of events, even where details differ. Voss reached for the pistol holstered at his belt. He did not draw it. Gurung's account states simply that the general's hand stopped before it completed the motion, and that he looked, in that half-second, not at the soldiers in front of him, but past them, toward the doorway and the hallway beyond it, where the sound of his own staff being secured without resistance was already audible. He understood, faster than pride might have preferred, what he was looking at. Not 4 men, not a raiding party that might be repelled by a determined response. The building was already taken. The sentries who would have given him warning were already gone. Whatever force was outside in the dark fields beyond his windows had already demonstrated a level of control over the situation that made any individual act of resistance. Drawing the pistol, shouting an alarm, attempting to barricade the room, not brave, but simply irrelevant to an outcome that had already been decided in the 4 minutes before he became aware anything was happening. His chief of staff would later say that Voss set his hand flat on the desk, deliberately, where it could be seen, and said nothing for several seconds. What Voss asked for, through an English-speaking staff officer who was brought into the room, was not mercy in any dramatic sense. He asked, formally and with the correctness that career officers of his generation had been trained into since their cadet years, that he and his staff be treated according to the terms of the Geneva Convention, and that he be permitted to surrender his sidearm to an officer rather than have it taken from him. It was, in the context of what was actually happening, an almost absurd request. A man negotiating the manner of his capture, while 40 soldiers he could not see held every approach to the building. But it was also, in its way, the only form of control left available to him. And Gurung, by his own later account, relayed through his battalion's war diary, granted it without hesitation, because it cost nothing and the outcome was already settled regardless. Voss surrendered his pistol to Gurung directly at 0331. 4 minutes had passed since the rear sentry was taken. The general, his chief of staff, 2 junior officers, and 11 clerical and signals personnel were secured without a single shot fired by either side, without a single Gurkha casualty, and without the alarm ever reaching the infantry company stationed a half-mile away, who learned what had happened only when a runner was sent at first light to ask why the headquarters had stopped answering its radio. By the time German reinforcements reached the farmhouse, Gurung's patrol and their prisoners were already a mile back toward Allied lines, moving in the gray light of early morning along the same canal system that had brought them in. There is a detail in the account that several of the men present remembered specifically, perhaps because it was the only moment of the entire encounter that felt, to them, recognizably human rather than purely tactical. Before he was moved from the building, Voss asked his adjutant, who was also being held a few feet away, to retrieve a fresh uniform jacket from his quarters upstairs. He explained when a Gurkha officer asked through the interpreter what he wanted, that he intended to be photographed and processed as a prisoner of war in a manner that did not suggest he had been dragged from his bed in disorder. The request was granted. Voss changed his jacket in the room where he had been captured, buttoned it correctly, and walked out of the farmhouse under his own composure to begin the walk back to Allied lines as a prisoner. Gurung's report does not editorialize on this moment. It states only that the request was made and that it was accommodated, and moves on to operational details: timing, route, condition of prisoners. But the detail survived in the retelling for 80 years because it captures something the rest of the report does not. A senior officer who had commanded men through some of the worst fighting of the war, faced with a situation he could not fight his way out of, choosing the only form of dignity still available to him, and a Gurkha patrol commander secure enough in what his men had just accomplished to grant it without a second thought. The capture of a senior German commander from his own headquarters, without warning and without resistance, traveled through both German and Allied chains of command with the speed such things tend to acquire. For the German side, it represented a specific and unwelcome confirmation of every rumor that had been circulating about Gurkha infiltration capability for the better part of 2 years. A directive issued to German rear area units in the sector within the week instructed headquarters elements to increase sentry density on all approaches, regardless of terrain assessment, and explicitly noted that terrain previously assessed as unsuitable for infantry movement should not be assumed secure against Gurkha patrols. It was a tactical lesson purchased at the cost of a general, his staff, and the kind of institutional confidence that does not return easily once it has been broken in a single night. For Gurung and his 40 men, the operation became one entry among many, in a campaign record that did not dwell on individual successes, in keeping with both regimental tradition and the simple fact that there was a war still being fought and a river still to cross. Gurung was recommended for the Distinguished Service Order. He accepted it the way Thapa had accepted his Victoria Cross a year earlier and 100 miles south, without ceremony, attributing the outcome to the men under his command rather than to himself. General Voss spent the remainder of the war in an Allied prisoner of war facility in southern Italy. He was repatriated to Germany in 1947. What became of him afterward is not well documented. He did not write a memoir, did not give interviews, and appears in post-war records only as a name on a list of repatriated officers, his rank noted, his unit noted. Nothing else. The farmhouse outside Fusignano is a private residence today. The canal system that carried 40 men past an entire infantry company in the dark still runs through the same fields, unremarkable, doing what it has always done, carrying water from higher ground to lower ground without any awareness of what once moved silently alongside it. There is no plaque. There was no single dramatic image to give this story the kind of visual shorthand that turns an operation into a legend. What there is, instead, is a war diary entry, a handful of post-war accounts that mostly agree with each other, and a question that sits underneath the whole episode the way it sat underneath the others. A general who had survived Stalingrad's edges and 2 years of retreat across a continent did not surrender because he was outfought. He surrendered because, in the space of 4 minutes, the entire architecture of his own safety, the sentries, the company and immediate support, the half-mile of supposedly secure ground around his headquarters, had been quietly dismantled by men who understood that the strongest defense is only as strong as the ground its defenders never thought to watch. That is not a story about mercy in the end, despite what the title promises. It is a story about a man discovering in real time that the war had already been lost in a place he never thought to look.